I'm Bill Oliver. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm an archaeologist and sort of a mutt, jack of all trades. I do a little bit of everything, none of it very well. But some of my friends do it quite well. Dr. Hanks, Dr. Ross, Dr. Bird, Gary Knight, and others. Ron Croson is in the back. Some of you know him, my partner in crime sometimes when we do things with GPR and electromagnetic profiling. However, at crime scenes, everything begins with photography. And sometimes it's difficult to realize how important it is until you run into a problem. And I think everyone's probably had a case where you look at photographs and you say, oh my Jiminy Christmas, what is this? Because something's out of focus, something's shot in the wrong order. Gary Knight is a professional photographer. He has more than 30 years of experience with the SBI and with CCBI, has his own web page and has been a contributor to our program for the past 5 years. Gary has worked with us on cases and emphasizes photography as a major form of documentation in the initial stages of the investigation. This is something that you may have had in the past, but I guarantee you haven't had it presented as well as from Gary Knight. With that, Gary Knight.
Okay, let's switch this over to. Okay, we're going to start out with talking about photographing a case with skeletal remains. You ask, first of all, is this any different than any other case that I normally work? Well, I'm here to tell you, yes, it is. This case is different. Your photographs in this case are going to be studied by more experts now than in any of your other cases. Your normal homicide case that you photograph, most of your photographs are used for illustrative purposes. In this case, you're going to have a lot of experts going to pore over all of your photographs trying to make determinations. Also, because these type of cases many times take years to solve, your photograph's going to be hanging around for many years and being referred to. Another point is that just small nuances in how you photograph the crime scene. The camera position, the angle, the lighting will make a big difference for these experts that are studying these photographs. Let's start out with some real basics. Your camera should be a tool. The use of that camera ought to come second nature to you. You need to familiarize yourself with the menus and the controls on your camera. Just as long as you know the basics, you're usually in pretty good shape. You want to keep your camera instruction manual with you. I don't mean put it on your person, I mean just keep it in your car so you can go back and refer to it as you need to. Our digital cameras today are so complicated and have so many menus in them you can't remember them all. So keep your instruction manual close at hand so you can refer to it when you get into some of those situations. What should be in a good camera outfit? Now I know most of you already have cameras that have been issued to you by your department, but if not, or you get asked later on what should we be buying, you want a good digital SLR camera. The point and shoot cameras we have out there today are great. They're big advances from what we had just 5 or 10 years ago. But point and shoot cameras have limitations to them. For one, a point and shoot camera, the sensor in it is only about the size of your thumbnail, whereas a digital SLR has a sensor in it about the size of a quarter. So 6 megapixels is not equal to 6 megapixels. So with that larger sensor, you're going to get a much better quality image. And when we start going back and going over these photographs and trying to enlarge them and look at small portions of them, that's going to make a big difference. Another thing, most of your point and shoot cameras and even your digital SLRs all come, many of them come with a small built-in flash unit. These flash units are not powerful enough to go beyond about 10 to 15 feet. So it's very important you have a secondary flash unit that's a good, strong flash unit that will work in the environments that we all get ourselves put into. The other thing you need in your camera outfit are at least 2 lenses, a wide angle or a wide angle zoom lens, something that will go out to something about 17 millimeters. You're going to need these for the overalls that you're going to be shooting. You also need a macro lens that will allow you to focus very closely. I know some of the point and shoot cameras today have macro capabilities, but you'll find them very awkward to use because of a problem called parallax. The last thing that I want to emphasize is having a tripod in your outfit. This is something that's often overlooked and people only think about needing a tripod for night photography. But when you're trying to photograph wounds or shoe tracks, tire tracks, anything like that, you'll find that the tripod will make a big difference in keeping the camera steady and eliminating camera movement. Okay, as soon as you get out of your vehicle and you start to photograph a crime scene, you need to sit down and immediately take your camera and go over and check some basic settings. If you familiarize yourself with all the settings, this should not be Greek to you. You have a mode selector on all your cameras that'll have a P, S, A, or an M. That's program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. Do you know what all those means, and do you know when you ought to be using them? Familiarize yourself with that. Even though 90% of the time we're all using program, we all have to admit that, you will still get a readout in your viewfinder telling you what your shutter speeds and f-stops are. You want to watch that shutter speed. That's the one that will get you in trouble the quickest. There is a rule of thumb called 1 over the focal length of the lens is the minimum shutter speed you ought to be shooting with. If you've got a 70mm lens, you should never handhold the camera below 1/70th of a second. If you have a 50mm lens, same rule. Okay. The other setting you want to check is your white balance. Well, there is an automatic white balance on most of the cameras, and that's what we use most of the time. If you come into this room right now with the fluorescent lights and shoot it on auto white balance, you're going to still get green pictures. So you want to adjust that white balance according to the conditions you are shooting under. Where you'll find that very helpful is just like later on today, when you get outside, you'll be working in bright sun, you will step underneath the shade of a tree, or if it becomes overcast. If you will adjust that white balance to an overcast setting or a shade setting, you will find that you won't pick up a blue cast to your photographs. So, even though you can use automatic, adjust that white balance according to your shooting conditions. Another thing that people overlook quite often is you're outside, bright sun, high noon, you think, oh, I don't need the flash, I'll leave that in the car. Bring that flash unit out, even in the high noon, because at that time of day, it's a very contrasty situation, and you'll get very dark shadows. If you'll use that flash unit on your camera, it will act as a fill-in flash and help lighten up and give you more detail in the shadow areas. The last thing to keep in mind is your f-stop. Your f-stop controls your depth of field, or amount in acceptable focus. And if you'll watch that f-stop setting and make sure it doesn't get down too low, you'll find yourself getting in situations where you might have 3 different planes of focus, 3 different items in the crime scene that you are trying to photograph all in one image, and you want them all in focus. Your depth of field controls that. The higher the number, like f16, f11, you'll find you'll have more in sharp focus. That's controlled by the f-stop. If you find yourself in that situation where you need a lot in focus, you might step up to aperture priority, where you can set that and the camera will pick out an appropriate shutter speed. So keep an eye on your f-stop. Okay, where do you start? Well, like any good crime scene, you're going to start out with your overall photographs. You want to show what the area looks like, how remote is it, what are the tree and the plant life like in the area. Is it an area that only a few people would know about? Is it like an electrical easement that only maybe power company workers would be aware of? You want to make sure you have photographs that show all of this, and it will come in very handy later on as people start studying your photographs. Google Earth is a great place to pick up satellite photographs that will show the remote area of your scene. Here, this is actually a Google Earth photograph of the area that you'll be working in later on today. These overhead or aerial photographs, Google Earth is very, very nice and very accessible, but sometimes you won't get the resolution out of them that you need. Keep in mind that your county GIS office or your Department of Transportation aerial photographs are available to you. The one problem you have with that is many times those are photographed in the winter when there's no foliage on the trees. That could be a problem for you, and if so, and you're lucky enough to have a helicopter available, aerials the day after your crime scene are very nice to shoot from a helicopter. Other ways of shooting overhead photographs would be from something like a fire department platform truck or an electrical utility bucket truck, or even from on top of your SUV. Here's an instance here where I had a crime scene where a body was found at the end of a cul-de-sac. While we were working the crime scene, we had two guys walk up to the crime scene tape and said, we got our truck stuck in the woods last night. Would you mind if we got that out? They turned out being our suspects. They had killed this girl earlier and had tried to use the dirt road here to get out and get back up on the main highway and got their truck stuck. You couldn't see it from the ground or anywhere around the crime scene. Bringing this platform truck out, we're able to get up high enough to put it all in one photograph. Another tool that's useful are panoramic photographs. Bet none of you have ever even thought about using that. But a panoramic photograph, when you've got a scene that's spread out over a large area, can be very good to show different areas of where bones were recovered or different areas that you searched. This is very easy to do with your digital cameras today. Couple of simple rules. You want to overlap your photographs by 25 to 30%. You want to keep the horizon line in the center of your viewfinder. And then you want to shoot this on manual so you can keep all of your exposures the same. Then you can go back and this will stitch together using Adobe Photoshop software, and there are a multitude of free, inexpensive stitching softwares that sometimes they even come with your camera. They can put the whole thing together seamless. You can't even tell that this photograph was made from 6 individual photographs. One caveat, don't make it more than about 180 degrees. Once you get it beyond 180 degrees, people will have a hard time getting their head around an image that shows more than they can normally see. Okay, we're going to start with our entry photographs. This should start out at the scene, at the street. You want to work your way in from the street or from a known location. This is a case that was out here between Raleigh and Cary out on Highway 54. First photograph is coming in through the gate. The rest of them lead down the road behind the buildings, down the little dirt road, and back into a easement area, which is where we actually found the body dumped. You want to make sure you've got photographs leading all the way into your search area. Okay, once you get back into the search area, you want to determine where that is, how big of an area it is. Is there more than one search area? If you might have more than one search area in a case like this because you might have had animals scavenging the body, pulling the bones away. And if you've got more than one search area, you want to make sure you have photographs that tie all this together. It's also very important to have overalls showing the search area in relation to those earlier entry photographs. Okay, once you get back into your search area, you want to shoot overalls of the area before any of the evidence is removed, before anyone enters the area, and before you start removing any of the foliage or the brush. After that, the next thing to do is to go to tape and grid off your scene. And again, here, this is another example of looking down on the scene using an electrical utilities bucket truck, just getting up over it and able to look down into the area where the skeletal remains were found. After you've done that, you're going to want to look at taking your measurements. You're going to want to take all these measurements from precisely located datum points. This will be very handy later on when you come in and start having to draw your crime scene drawing. These photographs should be shot before the area is cleared of any brush. As you find your evidence and you mark it with flags, you want to photograph it again, and then a third time after the brush has been cleared from the scene. Your photograph should show any foliage or brush that has grown up around the bones or the evidence. You might have a botanist called in later on, and they can help make determinations on how long those bones have been out there if foliage has grown over it. You want to make sure you record the position and the location of the evidence as it's found and its relationship to other evidence or other bones that are in the crime scene. We all learned this in Crime Scene Photography 101 to shoot overalls, mid-range, and close-up shots of your evidence. This is even more important in a skeletal remains case. As the crime scene photographs are shot, keep in mind on how they're going to be used in the future, not only by you, but all the others. You're going to be using these photographs to study your case and to present it in court, but others are going to use your photographs to make their determinations and conclusions. So you want your photographs to tell a story. If you will keep that in mind, you're telling a story with your photographs, it will help you immensely in your photography. You may understand what has happened thoroughly, but you want to make sure that you have photographs that will allow you to tell this story later on. Your photographs at some point are going to be used by other experts such as medical examiners, anthropologists, entomologists, archaeologists. They're all going to be making determinations, and they are going to be doing it from your photographs because most of the time they're not going to be out at the scene. And we all know we've had juries where we've had people with no more than an 8th grade education on the jury, and we want to make sure that you have photographs that can explain some of these complicated and scientific facts that you're going to be trying to explain in court. When you're finished, you're going to have a photo folder full of your photographs from the scene. You want to make sure that it flows very easily. If I look at a CD of photographs, they should be in the order in which they were shot, and you want this to flow very easily and be able to understand what happened. So you want to learn to shoot in a continuous, systematic process. This will make it a whole lot easier for you to refer back to them and understand what was going on. It will also be a lot easier years later when you have to go back and try to remember why you shot something. And I have had this happen numerous times where I was trying to go back on a case that was maybe 10 years old and look at it and try to explain to some attorney why did I shoot it and what was it showing. Okay, watch what gets into your photographs. Before you hit the shutter button on your camera, look in the viewfinder, look to all 4 corners. Is this what you want in this photograph? Take a look around and see if there's any officers, notebooks, walkie-talkies, equipment cases. All that stuff tends to show up in some of the photographs. You want to make sure you don't have that in there. One, it makes your photographs look messy, and then next of all, it gives defense attorneys an opportunity to question your crime scene processing practices. Don't do what I call being an evidence collector with a camera. Individual photographs of items are important, but having photographs that show them in relationship to each other are even more important. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen crime scene investigators come back in. They've had a shooting in a parking lot, and I have close-up photographs with scales of every shell casing found in the parking lot, and not a single picture showing the whole parking lot and where the shell casings were recovered from. That's even more important in these type of cases showing their relationship. Here we have a shirt in the top photograph and a skull in the bottom photograph. These are normal photographs that you would always shoot. Just a simple photograph showing both of them in relationship to each other will be very useful. As the evidence is being collected, make sure you photograph anything like if there's clothing at the scene and the bones are still in the clothing. What is the condition of the evidence? Is it weathered? Has it been damaged by animals? Is there any other type of damage like gunshots or stab wounds in there? These things are all important, and we know that, but experts are going to be studying your photographs later, and they need all these photographs to make their determinations later on. Here's a case where that same shirt I was showing you earlier, as we started to pick up that shirt and collect that piece of evidence, it was full of rib bones and vertebrae bones inside of it. You want to make sure you photograph all of this so it's available to these experts who can be studying later. Having an ME or an anthropologist on the scene will be of great assistance. I don't know about you, but if you give me a pile of bones and ask me to lay them all out properly, I will get something wrong, I will forget something. Having somebody here that can help you lay this all out is a great aid while you're out at the scene. An ME can help you identify the bones, find out if there are any that are missing that you need to be continuing searching for. Parts that are missing may indicate animal scavenging. If you've got maybe fingers or hands missing, this may indicate that they were removed to help hinder identification. Cases like this can be very hard to solve and take many years to solve, so make sure you have all the photographs you're going to need now while you have the opportunity. Let's take a quick look at how to properly photograph any evidence you find for comparison. This could be anything from latent fingerprints, shoe and tire tracks, or any subject that's going to be studied or measured and compared. As you photograph any shoe track, latent, anything like that that's going to be compared later, what's the one thing you must have in the photograph? A scale. Cannot tell you how many times we get pictures of shoe tracks or fingerprints and they're here. We want you to compare this with no scale in it. It's going to hinder that. They should all have be shot with and without a scale. And when you have the scale in the picture, it is very important that you have the scale run from one edge of the photograph to the other. If you use a scale that is too small, it's going to have to be duplicated when someone has to go back and size that for comparison. Okay, we're going to use a shoe track as a simple example. When shooting a shoe track or any other type of track, we all know you should keep the camera directly at 90 degrees perpendicular over the track that you're shooting. You can put the flash off to the side. Here's an example of a shoe track. The flash was left on the camera and shot straight down on top of the shoe track. You look at that and you say, oh, I've got it, I'm ready to go. If you will take that same flash unit and just move it off to the side, here it is shot at a 45-degree angle. You'll see now that the shoe track looks a little bit better. You can pick up a little bit more detail in it. Take that same flash unit, move it down a little bit more, bring it down to about 10 degrees so it's skimming across the top of the shoe track, and you'll pick up a lot more detail. Your examiner will really appreciate this later on when they go back and try to compare a shoe track or a tire track like this. So, as you're shooting shoe or tire tracks or something like this, keep the camera directly over your track and move that flash around. Shoot several photographs at different angles. Move the flash around from one side to the other. This will all create shadows in different areas and be a great advantage to the examiner later on. During this course, you're going to learn a lot of what can be done with your case if the evidence has been collected properly and it has been photographed completely. Anyone have any questions about photography at this point? Okay, everybody's ready to go.
Okay.
Okay, Billy?
Good. First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to Discovery and Recovery. In case you don't know, Discovery and Recovery is a course that we've created over the past few years. It actually arose from suggestions from various people in law enforcement and the scientific community to address issues with lack of scientific training, lack of certain types of certification, and it's prompted and led to consideration by North Carolina State University to create a world-class research facility that's a Center for Forensic Science. And with the assistance of Searchy and other companies, GeoSolutions, Ron Croson was here a little while ago, who does ground penetrating radar. We've offered technical assistance, we've conferred with people to make things better. In other words, what we want to do is develop tools. We're not detectives, we're scientists. And what we want to do in the long run is address research, education, and training needs in ways that maximize the talent and intellect and ability of the faculty found at a world-class university, which we happen to be. With that, I'm going to follow up on what Gary has begun, and if you noted, he mentioned several times the term every picture tells a story, or something about this particular picture. And what we have is, in crime scene photography and in investigation, every picture does tell a story. And sometimes that story is not very good because the photography or the documentation or the recording or the abilities of the person collecting the information are just not as good as they should be. The way to get better is to have better and better training. We're focusing on skeletal remains in this portion of the course. We're looking at things related to that, entomology, the various settings that are found for buried remains, for scattered skeletal remains. What we want to do is to clarify some of the things and how less familiar sciences can be applied to criminal and medical investigations. Some of those things involve anthropology, archaeology, geology, geophysics, chemistry, entomology, botany, and many, many other areas. We want to emphasize the preservation of what is found at the scene, and in some cases, depending on whether you have something that's on the surface or something buried, there may be types of associated evidence that you traditionally might not recognize. First of all, because you might not be able to see it. We're going to try and emphasize those things dealing with skeletal remains and other things related to various types of burials. Skeletal remains can be found in many different situations. In particular, the most common are scattered remains, where a body has been dumped or where a body has been secreted in some way and buried. This is an example which was a staged burial, but if you look at it carefully, you'll see that there are items with the individual. There's a hammer in the photograph. There are some other items. This was excavated as a training exercise and has to do with how you interpret a scene. But some things may not be as clear as the previous picture. If every picture tells a story, what's the story in this picture? What it shows you is that you have some textiles, but inside this textile happens to be a human bone, and it's actually part of an arm, the humerus, which is the upper part of the arm, and you'll learn that from Dr. Ann Ross as she does the anthropological lectures. But also there are other associated forms of evidence in this photograph that traditionally probably wouldn't be collected or wouldn't be analyzed. One of those is the surrounding vegetation and the leaves, but a more obvious one has to do with the textiles. It can have, following Locard's exchange principle, it can have trace evidence associated with it. All of you are familiar with that. But there are things associated with the textiles that may not be something that you or the analyst in your labs would be familiar with. Some of that has to do with the degradation over time of the fibers themselves, and also the color. And this is something that Dr. David Hinks, who is a textile chemist, specializes in. He and his colleagues can sometimes offer world-class assistance in the investigation of things dealing with textiles. Prior to creation of the program here at NC State, I think it was very seldom that they were contacted and asked for that type of assistance. Now it's becoming more frequent on high-profile cases. Another thing that you can't see here that Dr. Bird and Dr. Watson will emphasize has to do with the insects, with entomology. You don't see any insects in this photograph. However, the insects have been there. And by taking a soil sample in this area, you may recover pupal casings, which you'll learn about that from Dr. Bird and Dr. Watson. Other types of scattered remains can have evidence of cutting, tearing, can have trace evidence, DNA, but can have many different types of information that might be gathered, such as the root mat here and some of the deterioration of the textiles in this particular case. Every picture tells a story. The act of processing the scene actually destroys the scene. You only get one shot at this. So that one shot needs to be dead on target. So when you approach it using sound, rigorous scientific and archaeological techniques, you start, as Gary was talking about, moving from the outside in, narrowing your focus, basic recording principles, something that everyone knows, laying out the scene, establishing a grid. In your workbook, you're going to see that there are things listed, such as the 3-4-5 principle for how to make something square. There are many other ways like that also. And we're not going to spend a lot of time going through the workbook and saying, learn this, because we only have 4.5 days. Our purpose during discovery and recovery is to open your eyes, show you the picture, and lead you to form new tools that you can put into the toolkit. So how you use those tools is up to you. Viewing the scene, you can look at it from different perspectives. As Gary was saying, you can look at it from outside, inside. You can look at it from an overhead view, a plan view, and you can look at it close up. But in archaeology or in crime scene photography, it's very important to document things with scale. In archaeology, we generally do scale and no scale photographs. We actually duplicate everything that way. That's a personal choice. Establishing standardized numbering and recording. In the workbook, you'll see that we strongly urge everyone to establish someone at the crime scene as a recorder. Personally, I've seen recording that was not very thorough in some situations simply because people get too busy or they get stressed. And you've got too many things, and it's hard to write with a pen and paper when you've got decomp on your hands. So you need someone whose assignment is to record everything that takes place. You need a photographer to record photographically everything. You need someone to direct activity at the scene, the principal investigator, and then you need the other investigators, the worker bees, that can apply all the things that we're going to talk about in discovery and recovery. Establishing control points is critical. When you go into the field, we'll talk about establishing a control point, taking control samples outside the scene. Well, what's the purpose of this? The purpose is that if you recover evidence, such as soil, for example, that's going to be subjected to a type of analysis, let's say X-ray diffraction or FTIR, and you do not have a control, it weakens the results of your analysis. So by doing something very simple, take about 5 minutes, collecting a control sample, you can reference that sample to a permanent datum point, which we're going to talk about permanent datums and other types of reference points, the need for directional arrows, for taking control samples, establishing a grid, and working the area to process and maximize evidence recovery. In this particular case, we're looking at a story that hasn't been told yet. And so what we want to do is try and extract information from these photographs. You see a skull, and you see a chair, and you see a few other things. You see some remains here. And if you look carefully in the upper portion, you see a rope. Looking at it from an oblique angle, as Gary was indicating, you can see a distribution of the remains. Here's the cranial, the skull itself. Here's the clothing and some skeletal remains. And the question becomes, what do we have? Is this a homicide or is it a suicide? And looking at the remains and the distribution of the remains, it actually was a suicide, where the individual was hung, the tissue deteriorated, the skeletal remains due to gravity dropped and separated the skull rolled down the hill, and that accounted for the spatial distribution that we actually saw in the photographs. In archaeology, we have certain terms that are used. One is called provenience, or in Europe, perhaps in Canada, they say provenance. Our friend Dr. Hinks probably uses that term. I heard him say Buddha last night, and very distinctive terminology. But inference and analogy, provenience and association are key terms in archaeology because they have to do with the distribution and association of material items in space. Association is a relationship between two or more artifacts, activities, or events. Analogy, on the other hand, has to do with two or more observations that agree in probability, that indicates they will probably agree in other things. So it's a little speculative, but it's association. It's what detectives do. Inference has to do with passing from one observation, proposition, or statement to another based upon a certain observation. You know about deductive and inductive reasoning, and this is part of the scientific process. It's also part of the criminal investigatory process. When you go through death investigation training, you get all of this. It's also something that is repeated many times throughout every scientific process. The difference is that science needs to replicate any method or activity that occurs so that you can constantly get this result. Sometimes you get things that are laid out in such a way using methods that when you look at a photograph, you can say, something's wrong here. If you look carefully at this photograph, something's wrong here. If every picture tells a story, what's wrong with this photograph? Well, someone attempted to lay the skeleton out, but because they didn't quite know what they were doing, they put the rib cage upside down. So this should be up here. They also flip-flopped a lot of the other bones. So this person was either mutilated or had a lot of deformities in real life, and our medical examiner friends can probably look at this and say, boy, he had a long torso there. That's true, that's true. Gary mentioned helicopters, Google Earth, different things like that. Increasingly, people are taking advantage of different types of satellite and aerial photograph. This is actually an SBI overflight of a crime scene, which we investigated in Ashe County, and we were looking at this area for certain types of anomalies. Geologically, there's a term called unconformity, which means something that stands out from all the rest. An anomaly is a difference in the pattern, the regular pattern of things. And if you look at this photograph, when you look at different types of vegetation, look at different colorations, you can interpret things from this photograph. And if you look carefully right here, you see a different color soil. You also see an area here with some lighter soil. As it turns out, this was a burn pit where the suspect said that they burned trash and dead dogs and deer and different things like that. But it was suspected that this is where he had placed the body of a homicide victim. We excavated this to a depth of about 18 feet. When we got down to the bottom, in the very bottom of the pit, there was a newspaper that had a date on it 2 weeks preceding the date of the investigation, with 18 feet of material on top of it. What this tells you is that that pit had been excavated sometime after that date. And so in this particular case, we knew that all the fill had been excavated and disrupted and redeposited, and that's what these areas actually represent. And soil had been removed and scraped on the top to sort of cover it up a little bit. When we checked it out, we found that underneath this was all the trash from the bottom of this pit. You can tell that from the aerial photograph. From other types of photographs, sometimes you can look at the distribution of remains and tell something about how they were deposited. Gary mentioned in his presentation botany and plant growth. In this case, we had a situation of skeletal remains growing through, well, the plant remains growing through the skeletal remains, and a biologist, a plant biologist, was actually able to take a cross-section of the plant and date the plant growth to 3.5 years. Our victim disappeared 4 years ago. So we had plants being used to actually tie the remains in, which were scattered on a hill slope. And here is a form of documentation showing the distribution of the remains. These are called contour intervals. This was all done with a GPS unit, which I assume everyone uses, recording data and then putting those data points into a program called Surfer, which Ron Croson is going to talk about. The program created this map. which is a contour map, very quick and easy way to do it to show how the remains were distributed. Dr. Ross will be talking about anthropological remains and measurements and determinations of gender and ancestry and age and trauma. But more importantly, for my portion of the presentation, we want to talk about how things are recovered. And one particular example that plays into this has to do with a case. This is the Cynthia Moreland case in Wake County, which happened a few years ago. And if you look at the victim, you can see the appearance, but you see everything else out here is vegetation. What could you recover from this scene? One of the critical elements has to do with the insects that were recovered from here. The victim had several maggot masses which were collected. The CCBI investigators, which were called to the scene even though it was in Harnett County, had recently been trained in this course. Prior to that time, they had no ability or training to collect entomological samples. So this was the first case in which they were able to apply what they learned. It all began with documenting the scene. And at the scene, there were certain things off the road, a driveway, vegetation, some disturbances. These are the anomalies. And in this particular case, you see areas here and areas here that I'll call to your attention as we go along. These disturbed areas represent where tire tracks have been, but there's nothing here that you could take a cast from. What it did was actually deposit soil on the vehicle. Now soil, and we're not going to go into soil in depth in this, but if you look at this photograph here and then look at each one of these three, this photograph, the sandy clay loam, is composed of each one of these three. So soil has many different compositional factors, but the minerals that compose the soil can be identified, and sometimes with great certainty, depending on what type of analysis you actually put into play. What can soil indicate as evidence? Well, on the victim's car, which was found abandoned, there were scatterings of soil that you can see represent a splatter pattern. There was soil on the tires, soil on the undercarriage, particularly the muffler. When this soil was analyzed, a particular mineral was identified, and for lack of a better term, we'll refer to this as white mica. This mineral does not occur naturally in the Wake County environment. Well, why is that important? When the search began for the victim, we were asked to help 6 scientists within 24 hours put together an assessment of the soil from this car and reduce the entire area of the southeastern United States down to portions of 2 counties south and east of Raleigh. That's where ultimately the victim's body was found. Unfortunately, it wasn't soon enough. But there were other associations with this and other inferences that could be made. One of those has to do with the suspect's shoes, and when they were collected and analyzed, what was found was that the treads, newly acquired Air Jordans, had deposits of small minerals and soil. Well, the analysis of this soil produced white mica, similar to what was found in other areas. These areas included the driver's side floor mat, the outside soil of the car, and in the tire treads. There are many things that can be done in different types of analysis for this, but also on the car were fragments or pieces of vegetation. The vegetation was identified as a particular type of grass, and this grass grew in roadsides and was something that helped also narrow the area of search. Looking at the close-up of the driveway, it can be seen that there's a white stone. This stone actually contains white mica, and the stone had been excavated many, many miles away from a quarry, and deposited over the culvert at the driveway. It was the only place that occurred at this crime scene. So looking back, what can be interpreted is that the car was mired at the driveway. The suspect driving the car got out, stood in this, picked up particles of white mica, and deposited those on the floor mats. There were none found on the passenger side. Well, that's just one case, but what can you do in another situation where you're looking at photographs and you're using this multidisciplinary approach? Your good detective skills plus some enhanced knowledge of anthropology, archaeology, geology, and a few other sciences. One of those came from another person that participated in this class. They're the only crime scene investigator in a rural county. Shortly after taking this course, there was the discovery of a skeletonized victim. This victim had disappeared in 2004, so about 3 years had elapsed. The area of discovery was in an adjacent county. It had been covered up with tires, but underneath this tire pile there was an area of disturbed soil. And this soil, as you see in this photograph, had a depression. It was marked out by the investigators. The pit outline was noted as slightly oval. And if you look carefully here, you'll see that there's a bone protruding in this area. That's actually, again, part of the humerus, part of the arm. And this is a close-up of that. And something else can be noted. And here we see differences in soil color, in texture. We also see some textiles and a concentration of roots. The question becomes, what can we learn from this? And we also have something here which we can't really see yet. But when you look at this and you look at the root concentration, it should jump out at you that there are no roots over here and none over here to speak of in the same concentration and density. So when we look at a clearer excavation of this, and I use clear with some caution because this is actually not a very clear excavation. And you'll see some other photographs, you'll see some things in the book that if you use precise techniques, you can recover much more information from something like this. It's more difficult with something obviously that's decomposing and having tissue, but skeletonized remains can be very easy to work on if you know what you're doing, and we'll explain that in the field. In this case, you see that there is a watch associated. It's still on the wrist. There's some textiles, there's this root mat, and all the discoloration of the soil. Close-up shows also that we're dealing with the cranium, which is the object that we couldn't identify before, and again we have this concentration of root remains. We also have a very friable, loose soil. Now think, if this was deposited and then covered up with soil and then covered up with hundreds of used tires, the weight of the tires would compress the soil, and over time that soil would compress itself. What we're finding is inconsistent with that. This is loose soil. It means that it's been dug and redeposited fairly recently. In archaeological terms, it's called friable. There's also another anomaly, and the anomaly has to do with the occurrence of insect remains at the scene, on some of the textiles and up around the skull. These were identified as third instar maggots by Dr. Bird and Dr. Watson. If it's 3 years later, they shouldn't be here, unless there's a food source that would be sufficient to attract the flies. So what can be learned from this? Well, one is that the victim was clothed or partially clothed. The soil has been recently redeposited. In this photograph, you can see that the pockets of the pants have been turned out, and that might lead also to some interpretations. But here, more importantly, and Dr. Ross will deal with this, we see the victim's skull and we see a certain type of damage associated with blunt force trauma. Overall, looking at these photographs, the story that can be told can be supplemented by scientific analysis of the soil taken from the scene. Well, what could be learned? The answer is the body had been buried and kept for some time in an environment that was very humid or very moist, and then subsequently redeposited in this area. During the time that it was first buried or enclosed, a process took place that created what's called adipocere, and Dr. Ross will mention this in her lectures. This is a fatty deposit which ultimately attracted the insects as a food source. And eggs were laid, and the insects were attracted to that and went through the process of development. It tells us that we have a secondary interment. So this was an attempt by someone to hide the body in a more remote situation. They were fairly successful until it was discovered, but now going back, we can take what's in the photographs, reconstruct the events. The skeletal remains can go to the medical examiner and to the anthropologist, and we can learn more about the events that took place and how the victim died. The soil can contribute to this, and did. Soil scientists analyzed the remains and identified adipocere chemically from the soil that was taken by the investigator. And this tied back to this and strengthened the overall case.